Welcome to the Forest Overstory podcast. This podcast explores forest stewardship in the Pacific Northwest, helping landowners and professionals gain new insights and information in the field of forest management. The Forest Overstory is a product of the Washington State University Extension Forestry Program and is supported by the Washington Department of Natural Resources and the Society of American Foresters.
Hello, and welcome to the Forest Overstory podcast. My name is Kevin Zobrist, and I'm a professor and extension forester with Washington State University, and I'll be your host for this episode. We do thank you for joining us. It's always a pleasure to have you with us. And this episode's guest is Lauren Grand from Oregon State University. I've known Lauren for many years and have also had the privilege of working with her. Lauren, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me on the podcast, Kevin. It's really great to be able to work with you again.
Oh, absolutely. So glad to have you here. So, Lauren, to start with, why don't you tell us just a little bit about your current position, what you do at Oregon State University, and then we will get into our subject for the day, which is amphibians.
Great. Yeah, I'm a extension forester, so I work out in the field on behalf of Oregon State University's College of Forestry, and I teach forestry and natural resources classes to small landowners and natural resource professionals.
So, basically, you do the same thing I do.
Yes, that's right. So, in my role, I predominantly work in forestry, but I try really hard to bring in information about amphibian habitat and forestry management as it relates to thinking about how to protect habitats for amphibians. And that comes from a long history of me being really excited about learning about amphibians during a high school project. And then being able to work with amphibians again in relation to forestry habitats in graduate school. So I long loved interest in amphibians and I'm excited to share some of the things I know with you all.
Great. Thank you. So, to start here, what amphibians are here in Western Washington? So, we're going to focus on our wet West Side forest here. And specifically, what can small woodland owners expect to find on their property? What all is out there?
Well, I'll first by starting pretty broad. There's two types of amphibians that you'll come across in Western Washington. You'll have your frogs and your salamanders. And you're probably thinking, wait a minute, what about toads and newts? Well, frogs and toads are similar. There's actually no scientific difference between frogs and toads. It's really more of a difference in their appearance. The distinction between them is really loosely based on lifestyle. So, frogs are typically more aquatic, their skin's more smooth, and they have web feet and long hind legs that usually help them for swimming and jumping because they're typically more aquatic. Whereas toads are usually more terrestrial. And so they have features that help them with that lifestyle, including warty, dry skin and relatively shorter hind legs, because often you'll see them walking. And one time I was actually hiking in the Hoh Rainforest Trail and saw a western toad walking along the trail, and it was really fun to walk alongside a toad with me. But anyway, the difference between them isn't quite scientific as it is based on life history. They're warty skin and have poison glands behind their eyes. Salamanders and newts are part of the other group of amphibians that you might come across. And these are the ones that look more like lizards, but they're really more related to frogs and toads than they are other reptiles. And they have a trunk and they'll have four legs and a tail. Newts are usually more suited for swimming, and they typically have webbed feet, and their tail looks a little bit more like a paddle. So, those are the major groups of amphibians that you'll likely see in Western Washington. But to make things more specific, I will talk about some of the species that you could come across.
Lauren, before you go on, I want to go back to the poison glands on the frogs. What's that about?
So toads have specialized glands in their skin that produce a toxin that helps protect them as part of their self-defense mechanism. It acts as a deterrent for predators. So the hope is that predators under learned behavior understand that toads are poisonous to them and will avoid them.
That's fascinating. Lauren, can you tell us a little bit about kind of general life cycle of these creatures?
Yeah, oftentimes in the spring, a lot of their amphibians, at least ones that are water breeding, will come together and meet when weather starts to come to be above freezing, depending on where the different amphibians are on the landscape. Those that are sort of more in the valleys, water maybe doesn't freeze over the winter, but specifically for those that live up in the mountains, the amphibians need to wait until the waters defrost. They'll come together in the spring and lay eggs, and those eggs will stay in the water. And as the water temperatures increase, they'll slowly hatch and metamorphose into tadpoles. And those tadpoles will often live in the water, feeding off of various algae, and as they get larger, other insects. And then as temperature increases, they'll metamorphose into juveniles. Depending on the species, they'll hang around that area for a while before heading out into an upland forested habitat or other upland habitats. Some amphibians live in meadows or shrublands, but they will disperse then from their breeding pond or stream into these upland habitats to search for other vertebrates and species that they would be eating before returning back to breed when they are of breeding age as adults. And that age is different for each type of amphibian. So the thing here is that amphibians actually require the juxtaposition of two habitats for their lifestyle. They require an aquatic habitat as well as a terrestrial habitat. And most of the species need that aquatic habitat for the reproduction phase of their lifestyle before moving up into that upland habitat. There are, however, some species that don't lay their eggs in water, but they do require moist areas because if their eggs dry out, then they wouldn't be able to hatch and become adults. Their eggs would still die. So even though they're being laid on land, they still need to be in a moist area like a rotten log or really moist soil with heavy duff or moss so that those eggs don't dry out and desiccate.
How do frog versus salamander and newt tadpoles look different?
All tadpoles have external gills. As they metamorphose into juveniles, they start to grow arms and legs. There are a lot of salamanders, however, that stay in the aquatic phase and they can maintain their external gills. They look like little filaments at the base of their head or in their neck area and stay in that aquatic phase where they'll maintain those gills. Their body shape is usually wider and their tail will typically stay in more of a fin shape and live aquatically for an extended period of time. The information around why some species tend to do this is not entirely known, but it's hypothesized that, there's different reasons related to it. Either that there is enough resources where the amphibian or salamander decides that, you know, food is really plentiful here. I don't have to work really hard to find food and stay alive. And so this is a good habitat for me, and I'm going to stay in this phase. And some think that the hormones related to their metamorphose get halted for some reason. Something in the environment is changing their hormone makeup that causes them to stop metamorphosizing and stay in that aquatic phase. Another feature that salamanders hatch with is that they actually have all four of their legs when they hatch. And so the tadpoles have this wide head those external gills, and all four legs. But both frogs and salamanders don't stay tadpoles or in their aquatic phase too long, typically a couple weeks, depending on temperature level of the water.
Lauren, you mentioned food. What do amphibians eat?
Well, that depends on the amphibian. They tend to eat a lot of insects, snails, other amphibians. They're actually a really important middle portion of the food web. So when they're tadpoles, they can eat algae and other smaller insects, things that fit in their mouth. And as they turn into adults, they become predators of other insects and snails, other amphibians. Some of the reasons why the American bullfrog is such a difficult invasive species to work with is because it has a really big mouth and it likes to eat anything that fits in its mouth. And so um, it can eat lots of our native amphibian species.
So you're saying it's a frog eat frog world out there.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
So tell us a little bit more specifically about what species of amphibians small woodland owners can find on their properties.
I say the one that I hear the most about is the Pacific tree frog, or some people call it the chorus frog. And it's that little green frog, or people refer to it as a little green frog that sings in the spring. They all come together in chorus, and it's that typical croaking sound that you hear in the movies. I actually learned from a wildlife biologist that this croaking sound is the one that they record for movies. It's the typical sound. But anyway, they all get together and they sing, and it's quite pleasant in the spring. And those, you'll hear that croaking. You also see it hopping around in general. They're in large populations throughout the entire state. And so they're probably the most common that people see. They like to, in the spring, when they are breeding, the males like to sort of spread out on their bellies and lay on the water and call, stretching out their big throats, croaking to find new mates. And so you can see them sort of floating in the water as well as hopping around wetlands, specifically in the spring. I'd say that the salamander that people see the most often is rough-skinned newts. I've had people tell me that they call them water dogs because they're so common, but these are salamanders that have a rough back. Their skin is rough, and their belly is a bright yellow to orange color. And they are pretty terrestrial species. They hang out by water predominantly to breed, and then they can travel pretty far into forested habitats for a lot of their life cycle. Though they do really enjoy swimming, as I mentioned earlier, newts tend to have more of a aquatic interest, so they have more webbed hands and flipper tail. So a lot of people do see newts in their pond. So if you have a pond, you probably see them swimming around all the time. But I often see them out in the forest when I'm doing site visits. Just also another species that really likes to use our human made trails and kind of just hanging out at the base of trees, soaking up that relative humidity and hanging out in the duff where there's lots of insects to feed on. So those are probably two most common that people will see. The other salamander that if you really like to go herping, which just means you like to go out and specifically look for amphibians or reptiles, the most common and probably most abundant terrestrial salamander is Ensitinas. They're the ones that I see the most often if I'm going around and I'm hunting for chanterelles and I'm like, "Oh, a stump. I'm going to dig in the bottom of this stump." I'll often see one of them, hanging out there just staying wet and looking for insects. The other day I did a site visit with a landowner and they were really excited. They were showing me these old growth trees that were on their property and one of them had broken. I of course was really excited about the log that was rotting and I just immediately picked up just even a top piece of wood that was on there and found a juvenile ensatina right there on top. And so it's probably one of the most abundant species also that you can find in forests. A lot of times in, down wood, easy to find. And those are really cute. They're easy to spot because they have yellow armpits. And so that's how you pretty much know it's an ensatina. So right in the corners where their arms meet the trunk of their body, it's usually a yellowish or an orange color right in all four of their armpits. But the other distincting characteristic is there's a little crimp in their tail where it attaches to their body. And of course, that's for the self-defense mechanism where if a predator goes after them, they'll drop their tail and let it wiggle around while they run away so that they can survive and the predator's looking for their tail.
And do they have any problem growing a new tail then?
They can grow a new tail. It takes a bit of time and it's never as long as their original tail, but they do grow a new one eventually.
How about the Pacific salamander?
Oh, Pacific giant salamanders. That one's one that everyone gets really excited about. There's two species of giant salamanders, the Cope's giant salamander and the Pacific giant salamander, and those are really cool. They're the largest salamander that we have, and they can grow up to 13 inches in size. They're pretty difficult to distinguish from each other, but the Cope's giant salamander typically doesn't metamorphose into the adult phase. It tends to stay in its aquatic phase. But these guys are stream associated amphibians and they require headwater streams for their reproduction. And so you'll often find them near the edges of streams where they're pretty complex, where there's riffles and pools both near each other. And they use the splashing of the water to keep their bodies moist if they've fully metamorphosed to adults. And they usually hunt for insects in those pools. But when they're reproducing, they lay their eggs on the bottom of rocks. And they're a very bright white colored egg in an egg mass. And they stick them to the bottom of the rock to keep them from floating downstream.
So, Lauren, if you find one of these wonderful creatures out there in the woods, is it okay to touch them or pick them up?
Well, I'd say that you probably don't want to interact that much with wildlife in general. Amphibians, in particular, have a permeable skin. And so, if you have anything on your hands that could be potentially transferred into their body, then it's probably not a good idea to touch them. So, if you're somebody who uses perfumey style lotions or soaps or anything like that, any of the residues related to anything that you've been touching throughout the day could be transferred to them and easily taken up by their skin, which they need to keep moist. So, really facilitates that easy movement. And so I would really not recommended that you touch them. If you're working on a special project like citizen science or something like that, it's good to follow the recommendations of the organization you're working with. And oftentimes gloves are a good way to keep the transfer of those contaminants from getting into their body. So often, a lot of times too, they have different self-defense postures. So the different species that you'll find, if you poke at them or touch them, they might show off their self-defense posture. And northwestern salamanders, for example, is another really common one. Those are really easy to spot in ponds during breeding season, or at least their egg masses are really easy to spot. They look like giant oranges, or they're the size of a giant orange, and they're hard, and they attach them to sticks and other vegetation, and you'll see a bunch of little eggs in them. Those are sort of the gateway egg mass, if you will, for amphibians. But anyway, those will sort of scrunch up and excrete this milky toxin to tell you, don't eat me, leave me alone, I'm stressed out. So you don't want to stress them out because anything that stresses them out could cause them to potentially not be able to complete one of their future life needs, right? The more an animal is stressed out, the less likely it's able to perform well in finding a place to hide or something to eat. So just keep that in mind when you're looking for or finding various different amphibians.
So, observe, but maybe not touch.
Yeah, observe, maybe use your camera. You can enjoy it later too and see different parts of the amphibian, but try not to touch.
Is it true that I think it's the rough skinned newt has toxins on its underbelly that you don't want to get on your hand?
Yes, it has a neurotoxin as part of its self-defense mechanism. Its belly is a bright color as a way to warn predators, "Don't eat me." It also has one of those pretty distinctive self-defense postures where it'll sort of arches back and curl their tail upward so that it's showing off the yellow-orange pigment in their belly. And it's trying to say, "I'm toxic, don't eat me." And pretty much it kills everything that tries to eat it, except for the most part garter snakes. And there has been a lot of research looking into how these two animals have evolved over time to tolerate each other. So, long story short, the rough-skinned newt has a neurotoxin that is really potent. So, humans definitely shouldn't eat them. Really try to avoid having your pets eat them as well because they can cause pets to die. Humans have died from eating them on dares or hazing programs, so definitely not a delicacy that you want to, try out.
Yeah, definitely not. So, can you talk a little bit more? I mean, I know you have already, but talk a little bit more about their habitat on small woodlands and maybe things that landowners can do to improve habitat if they want to attract more amphibians.
Sure. So there's definitely two things that you'll want to consider when you're thinking about habitat for amphibians. And one of the really important things is that when you think of amphibians, most people think about the fact that they're aquatic associated or they're only around water. But just trying to remember that the upland habitat of their life cycle, and even for some species, they only live in forested habitats or upland, these upland non-aquatic habitats, that those are just as important because those are necessary for the two parts of their lifestyle. So thinking about, which types of amphibians you're really interested in, and also thinking about what type of water features are on your property. If you don't have any water features on your property, then you can't manage them, obviously. Or you could look into potentially putting in a pond, which would be a great resource for those pond breeding amphibians that require still water to be able to breed. There's a significant number of amphibians that require water that is slow moving, which would be a pond would be suited for them. And so if you do have a pond or you're interested in creating a pond, you'll want an area that is, at least 2 to 3 feet deep and has edges of the pond that sort of go down in a gradient. You don't want a steep drop off. That's because that will help with allowing the tadpoles to regulate their temperature as they move throughout the water and also be able to hide and feed off of the different types of insects that might be moving around in the water based on the different temperatures, based on depth, and also oxygen levels based on depth. You'll also want to make sure there's what we call emergent vegetation, and it's just a fancy way of saying plants that are rooted in the water but stick out of the top for the most part. And that's because that's where those amphibians attach their eggs so that the eggs stay submerged in the water and don't float off or don't sink to the bottom and lose oxygen availability. You want a little bit of sunlight in the pond because that helps for some species to decrease certain types of fungus that could add to mortality rates or issues with amphibians. So, those are some things you want to think about when you're managing your ponds or creating a pond specifically for amphibians. If you have streams on your property, typically following forest practice rules will also help to benefit the amphibian habitats, but making sure that there's adequate shade to keep the water cool, that the water's moving, and there's lots of rocks and areas where the water's moving fast to create oxygen in the water, but also pools to make sure that there's areas for amphibians and tadpoles to be able to rest and eat and catch different invertebrates that might fall into the stream from that outside vegetation. You want to make sure that those aquatic habitats are connected to some type of terrestrial habitat because of the amphibians are moving from this water to the upland habitat. And so thinking about the fact that there need to be some type of corridor, and riparian buffers usually work really well for this, but some corridor to get to that upland habitat because they need to be able to transfer from aquatic to terrestrial with shelter and relative humidity to keep their skin moist. In those upland habitats, yeah, definitely an understory layer where there's lots of vegetation that helps keep relative humidity high by the forest floor, thick layers of mosses and duff that hold on to moisture, and then rotten logs, the thing that holds on to moisture the best on the forest floor. And as those rot away, they become really great biodiversity areas for invertebrates that are the one of the main food sources for amphibians. And specifically for salamanders that tend to burrow and hibernate underground, they really like to be in dark, moist places for extended periods of time. So the more downwood that you can have on the property and the larger size, the more helpful it is for your amphibian friends. And if you don't have large single logs, you can always take a bunch of smaller logs and pile them together lengthwise so to mimic the size of a large down log.
And how about habitat piles? Will those also help amphibians?
Yeah, thanks for reminding me of that. Habitat piles are a great way to help amphibians. You can actually make habitat piles out of wood and rocks. So, piles where you have larger rocks or logs down at the bottom, and then the more fine or smaller rocks, fine woody material or smaller rocks at the top, will be the best shaping for habitat piles. And those are really great because not only do they create a situation where there's lots of food coming in to see what's going on in the habitat piles, but also because it allows amphibians to move up and down through the pile so that they can regulate their body temperature.
Well, thank you, Lauren, for all of this great information. This is super interesting and really appreciate the practical tips that we can all use to enhance amphibian habitat on our property and maybe attract more.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Well, that concludes this episode of the Forest Overstory podcast. Thank you, Lauren, for being with us for this episode. And thank all you listeners for being with us. And we hope that you'll join us for the next episode of the Forest Overstory podcast.